A religion scholar stood up with a question to test Jesus. "Teacher, what do I need to do to get eternal life?" He answered, "What's written in God's law? How do you interpret it?" He said that you love the Lord your God with all your passion and prayer and muscle and intelligence, and that you love your neighbor as well as you do yourself. "Good answer," said Jesus. "Do it and you'll live." Looking for a loophole, he asked, "And just how would you define neighbor?" Jesus answered by telling a story. There was once a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. On the way, he was attacked by robbers. They took his clothes, beat him up, and went off, leaving him half dead. Luckily, a priest was on his way down the same road, but when he saw him, he angled across to the other side. Then a Levite religious man showed up. He also avoided the injured man. A Samaritan traveling the road came on him. When he saw the man's condition, his heart went out to him. He gave him first aid, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds. Then he lifted him up onto his donkey, led him to an inn, and made him comfortable. In the morning he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take good care of him. If it costs any more, put it on my bill. I'll pay you on my way back." What do you think? Which of the 3 became a neighbor to the man attacked by robbers? "The one who treated him kindly," the religion scholar responded. Jesus said, "Go and do the same."
I'm sitting on a bench in a park in a town called Menlo Park in California. It's a nice bench, my bench. It's kind of comfortable. But it serves as a reminder to me that there's a big world beyond this bench, and that God is calling me to do something besides sit on a comfortable bench and watch the world go by. One of the stories that Jesus told that most gets at this issue is his famous story about a character who has come to be known as the Good Samaritan. Now, of course, in Jesus' day, to the people to whom he was speaking, there was no such thing as a Good Samaritan. They were despised folks. But Jesus is talking about how central compassion is to the heart of God, and how when somebody is hurting, when somebody is in need, that person who has God's kind of heart actually does something for the needy person that he or she sees. It's a fascinating study done several decades ago now at a seminary of people who were studying to be church leaders, to be pastors. They were told that they had to give a talk someplace across the campus. And while they were on their way to give that talk, they passed an alley and there was a person laying on the ground in need, moaning. They didn't know what the situation was. What's fascinating is that most of them did not help. Most of them didn't even stop to see what the problem was. They were too busy having to travel to another place to give a talk. In many cases, it was to be a talk about a passage in the Bible. Want to guess what passage it was? They were on their way to give a little sermon about the parable of the Good Samaritan. But simply knowing the story of the Good Samaritan doesn't mean that we will actually do what it is that Jesus says he wants his followers to do. I have a couple of good friends, Todd and Lil, and they had a really nice bench, living a really good life. But God got a hold of their hearts, and they had a strong sense of God asking, would you be willing to get off the bench, to go out into the world, and help some people who are kind of laying by the side of the road. In their case, it was to have a burden for folks suffering from AIDS in Africa. And they were willing to be inconvenienced. And they were willing to help and to invite other people to help with them. And they would tell you the adventure that they went on is one of the most exciting journeys of their lives. Because the adventure of compassion is the journey for which you were made, to which you and I are called by Jesus. And it starts as simply as this: being willing to pause and listen and be interrupted.
The first thing I notice about this story is that Jesus doesn't answer the man's questions. In fact, that's often true. I read somewhere that 183 times in the Gospels, somebody came up to Jesus with a specific question. Do you know how many times he gave them a direct answer? 3. The rest of the time, he would either respond with a story, as he did in this case, or throw the question back to them. This expert in the religious law had a very clear question. He said, okay, I'm supposed to love God, I do that. I'm supposed to love my neighbor as myself. So who is my neighbor? Tell me, define for me. I can check that off my list. And I am sure that he expected Jesus to say, well, your neighbor would be other Jews or people who live around you, those people out there. Jesus doesn't do that. He tells the story, and in the story, he makes the point that your neighbor is not a group out there that you can just check off. You become the neighbor. You're the one who becomes the neighbor to a person in human need. What I like about that is that it gives a place for every one of us. There are some people who are called to care about AIDS orphans in Africa. There are other people involved in prison ministries. There are some who go to nursing homes. There are some who just stay at home and take care of another family member. But in each of these ways, we can respond as Jesus told in this story. We can become a neighbor to the person in need.
I was a 17-year-old girl fresh out of high school when I took a reckless dive into the Chesapeake Bay. The waters were murky, deep, dark. I struck my head on a sandbar that snapped my head back, crushing my vertebrae and leaving me paralyzed without use of my hands or my legs. Now, I knew in some vague kind of way that the Bible probably contained answers for my predicament. I just had no idea where to look. And in fact, I was too demoralized to look. I didn't need somebody to come up and present to me a program or a step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is how you get out of depression. I didn't need something that inert or dry or mechanistic. I needed something living and breathing and dynamic. I needed Christians as Christ incarnate, because I was that wounded man by the side of the road. I needed a Good Samaritan who was interested in transformational ministry. It was interested in redeeming my life from the pit and getting me looking at life, sitting up, face forward, and hopeful. Because that's what the Good Samaritan did. He was interested in redemption. His was not a one-time ministry to this single man. No, he went all the way. In fact, he went the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th mile. We need Christians who will do that today. Not present a program, but love people the way Christ did.
Yeah, I was in Haiti, and I was about ready to eat. They had me in this restaurant. I was sitting right by the window. The waiter had brought the food and put it on my plate. And I looked to my right, and here were 3 little Haitian boys with their noses pressed up against the glass, staring at the food on my plate. I just dropped the fork and looked at them. The waiter, seeing my discomfort, moved in quickly, pulled down the window shade, and then he said, "Don't let them bother you. Enjoy your meal." Needless to say, I did have to respond to those little boys. But I thought about that experience often. And I wonder how many times there are people who are close at hand, who need our help. And we have a tendency to what? Pull down the shade and pretend they're not there. I remember an old song from when I was young. That's a long time ago. Bob Dylan singing. And one of the lines of the song was, And how many times must a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? That line runs chills up my back. And I wonder how many times I turn my head and pretend that I just don't see because I don't want to see. Because if I see and don't respond, I'll feel guilty. People say, guilt? I'm against guilt. I'm not. Guilt is a healthy reaction to sin. And it's sinful if you can help and don't. It says this, 1 John 3:17-18. If you have this world's goods, and you know of brothers and sisters who are in need, you see that person on the side of the road in desperate need, and you keep what you have while that person suffers, how can you say, I have the love of God in my heart? Fair question.
Well, I always say, have you seen something wonderful? The sea. The sea is not just one expanse of water. It's actually drops of water that have come together. And we're not expecting you to say feed everybody, but you can feed. You can feed one person, you can feed two people, or you can make available to organizations the ability to do that on your behalf. And each one of us has a role. I mean, I've usually said, do your little bit where you can, because it is those little bits that go to make the difference. We mustn't allow ourselves to be immobilized by the enormity of the problem, because, as they have said, there is only one way of eating an elephant, one piece at a time.
Mother Teresa said, we can do no great things, but only small things with great love. It's not how much you do, but it's how much love you put into every act.
One of my favorite stories is of the little boy. He's walking down the seashore, and it's an old story we've all heard, but it's still very powerful. And he reaches over and picks up a starfish and throws the starfish back into the water because he'd washed up on the shore. And the little man said, boy, what are you doing? He said, I'm throwing starfish. I'm saving starfish. He said, you don't think you can save all the starfish in the world? I mean, it can't matter that much. And as the little boy reached over and picked up another one and threw it, he said, it mattered to him. And that's how we have to look at life. Can I feed every hungry child in the world? No. Can I buy a mosquito net for every kid in Africa whose life might be saved by a $9 mosquito net? I probably can't buy them all. But if I buy one mosquito net and that saves a kid's life or keeps him from getting malaria and being sick for the rest of his life, doesn't that matter? Matters to that kid, matters to that kid's mom and dad. You bet it matters.
How can I, as a person, do something? So how can I, one person, do something, but not just me, but I think bring other people together? Because, we have an African proverb that say, if you go alone, you only go so far. But if we go together, we go even very far away.
Things change when a new generation decides this that was acceptable is no longer tolerable. We're not going to accept that anymore. Or that which we thought was impossible, now we think could be done. So when I talk to a crowd, I say, we got climate change, it's worse than people thought, we got growing poverty now and economic crisis, we got pandemic diseases, we got HIV. My goodness, does this feel too big to you? And they say, oh, it's so big, it's more than we can do, it's too much for us. I said, yeah, it feels that way. Don't they feel like mountains? We have to move. They say, yeah, they feel like mountains. What does the Bible say about if you have faith the size of the grain of a mustard seed? What can you move? And they say, mountains. I said, what? Mountains. And I make them say it until they're saying, mountains! And I want to say, people of faith are in the mountain moving business. Revivals, movements of faith, take on mountains that couldn't be moved were it not for that spark of faith. So this is critical. It's never just the people of faith, but not one, this is important, not one successful social change movement in this nation's history has succeeded without the central involvement of people of faith. Not one.
There are roughly 6 billion people in the world, and 1 billion of them do not have access to clean drinking water. 20% of the world consumes 86% of its resources. Tonight, there are 6 billion people in the world, and somewhere around 800 million of them will go to bed hungry. There are 6 billion people in the world, and of that 6 billion, 1 billion survive on less than $1 American dollar a day. Another 2 billion survive on less than $2 American dollars a day. There are 2.2 billion kids in the world. Of those 2.2 billion kids, half of them, 1 billion of them, live in poverty. Now, I don't know your worldview, I don't know your perspective, your background, or your religion, but that is not right.
Christians are potentially the most powerful people on the planet. I don't think we really realize how powerful we can be and the difference we can really make. Not to wax scriptural, but Christ trained 12 disciples. They turned an entire world upside down.
We really take scripture seriously. Like, we do devotions every day in our family, the 6 kids, my husband, and he's waking up early and walking around our house and praying for us. It's not like it's something we just kind of revisit here and there. It literally is the fabric of who we are. And so, that being the case, James, the book of James, tells us clearly in chapter 1 that religion that God our Father finds pure and faultless is to look after widows and orphans in their distress. And so because of that, it's a literal command. And we take it very seriously. Now again, that doesn't mean that everyone's gonna go to Haiti and, adopt children. But it does mean that we're called to do something. And not to just be about coming home at the end of the day and plopping down on our nice couch and turning on our flat screen TV and popping in a DVD and just kind of doing that all and then waking up the next day and doing it all over again. There's no meaning to that. And there's no joy in that. And I once read quotes from some of the richest and most wealthy people in the entire nation, and their quotes were full of despair because they didn't get it. We were created to serve. And in that sense, we must go forward. We must serve. There's no other way.
It's ironic in looking at the story of the Good Samaritan that there's a common ingredient that all 3 characters that we find actually used. The priest and Levite had that oil and wine. They would have been experts, well-trained in how to use oil and wine in worship and the utilization and special services that they had with the people. These were pros. These were oil and wine pros. And they used it in worship. Then along comes the Samaritan. He's got oil and wine too, but his act of worship is to actually go and dispense it on the guy in the ditch. The closest that the guy's who had come before him, the priest and the Levite, would have been to take the oil and wine and probably chuck it across the road. Hey, use it. It's really good for you. I hope you feel better, which I think is sometimes the way people in ditches feel about our worship. The Samaritan actually took these ingredients and got down, my guess, on a knee and began to rub them into the wounds of this guy, putting him on a donkey and then taking him away. In a real sense, this was the Samaritan's act of worship. And a church on the go, a church that's really growing, a church that's really alive to their community, this, I believe, is their view of worship too.
Jesus said in Matthew 25 that if we're faithful in the little things, he'll entrust us with big things, and then we'll enter into the joy of the Lord. You can't enter into the joy of the Lord unless you're faithful in doing what he said. I think a lot of people have a desire to help other people. We were made that way. We were made to love people with the love of Christ. But a lot of times it's intimidation. What happens if I get rejected? What happens if it doesn't work? What happens if I don't know what to say? Walking by faith is scary. Walking into the unknown and the unfamiliar is scary. So there are people out there waiting for us to talk to them and love them and encourage them. If we would only by faith believe that and trust that God's not going to forsake us.
I think the first thing I noticed about the Good Samaritan story is that it's not like he stood on the opposite side of the road and tossed canned goods and a religious tract at the guy. He crossed the road, he got up close and personal. He dirtied his own hands, he tore his own clothing. There was something very relational, very hands-on about his ministry.
I think the story of the Good Samaritan opened my heart to a new way of looking at the world, but then I had to move beyond that and say, what do I do? And so the first thing I started doing was just praying that God would give me the eyes of the Good Samaritan to see, and give me the willingness to get up close to people in need. And then I started praying a prayer which has probably become the most significant prayer of my life, that I pray over and over again, but simply this: God, what is mine to do? Sometimes I need to hear God say, I know you care about such and such issue, but that's not yours to do. I have somebody else to, take on that. But sometimes I need to hear God say, yes, this is yours to do. Maybe it scares you, maybe it pushes you a little bit, maybe it really stretches you more than you want to stretch, but this is yours to do. So listen to me, follow my guidance, obey me, and you will not be sorry. As I've talked with a lot of women about this, I've realized that it's often the first step. That's the hardest. You want to do something, you want to get involved. Maybe you listen to something on the news and it just makes you cry, which, by the way, I think is a very important way to kind of discern God's direction, in your life. What makes you cry? What do you hear about and you just can't stand the fact that that exists? But then what do? I think we often think that the only thing that's worth doing is something really big, but how do we do that? And so I think it's much more important to start out with something really small. If I'm concerned about an issue, how can I learn more about it? Can I find a book to read? Is there a website I can look at? Can I get 5 friends together and talk about that and say, what do you know about that? Do you know of any organizations that respond to that? And just begin the learning process. I think that's where it has to start. And then figure out what is one step you can take to move forward. There's a quote that I keep on my desk. It's taped up onto a lamp where I see it every day, and it says this: I am only one, but I am one. I can't do everything, but I can do something. And I will not let what I cannot do interfere with what I can do. And I need to be reminded all the time, every day, that yes, I am only one, and I can't do everything, but I can do something, and you can do something, and everyone can do something. And if we all did that little something that we each can do, we could make a huge difference for God and for good and for the cause of justice in the world.
When you look at church history, a lot of churches focus on believing the right thing, the correct thing. But when you look at Jesus' stories, most of the time he's talking about how are you acting? How are you demonstrating your beliefs? I saw a beautiful example of a church who's doing just that in South Africa. In fact, you're going to meet the pastor, John Thomas. Ordinary Baptist pastor of a suburban church in a little coastal town in South Africa. Well, he found out that in one of the slums, one of the shanty towns next to him, there were thousands of people who were infected with the AIDS disease. In fact, he found a rather shocking statistic that 70% of 5th and 6th graders were sexually active in that community. Some people estimate that within 10 years, half of all children 15 years old and under in South Africa will be dead because of AIDS. And he thought, that's not right. So he started getting involved with these people, with their lives, and his church formed these programs to reach out. It has won one of the Church of the Year awards from World Vision because of their great work. And in fact, 3 times as much money goes to their AIDS program in the church as goes to the church. They have only 10 people on staff in the church. They've got over 150 people on staff reaching out into the community. John told me of a story of a little 14-year-old girl who had a baby. He visited her in the hospital, and the baby had AIDS, contracted it in utero. And he knew the local language, and in the local language, this little girl had named her baby No Hope. As he talked to her, as his church people worked with her, one day she said, I'd like to meet this Jesus you keep talking about, because no one else treats me the way your people do. And eventually, at the end of the story, she changed her baby's name, legally changed the baby's name to The Lord is My Hope. My question after hearing that story was, who do you think is the neighbor in that little town in South Africa? I know who those people in the shantytown will say. Oh, it's Living Hope Church, because they're the ones who've reached out to us. They're the ones who've come to us. Now, I've been to that church, and there are some people who are medical professionals, yes. But there are other people in the church who do nothing but answer phones all day, who stuff envelopes all day, who just hold a baby, an AIDS orphan. That's their job as part of the body of Christ. As we begin this journey together, I don't know what this parable is going to speak to you about, what your role is going to be. But Jesus calls each one of us to respond to a world full of needs. We won't do it in the same way, but if we do it, we'll be answering the question that lawyer asked, who is my neighbor?
Look down from a broken sky, traced out by the city lights. My world from a mile high, best seat in the house tonight. Touchdown in the cold black top.
So I'm going to work, and I have to walk down this hill during the winter time. It's really hard because it's covered with ice. I walk, and there's a guy sleeping right here on the ground, and there's snow everywhere. It's 7 degrees outside, and I didn't know what to do.
Give me your eyes for just 1 second. Give me your eyes so I can see everything that I...
So I just went back to my office and reflected on it and got to work. The story of the Good Samaritan was really beating me up inside because, you know, the Samaritan wasn't the person that was supposed to help, and he did. Well, I'm a Christian, and I work at a rescue mission. I am the person who's supposed to help, and I'm not helping. About 9:30, so an hour and a half later, I had to run an errand. And I came back out, and I'm walking up the hill, and the guy's still there. And I'm not gonna walk by this guy this time. And I leaned over, and I was like, sir, can I help you? It's warm. If you just get in right there, if you go in those doors, it's warm. You're gonna freeze out here. And I nudged him, and he wouldn't move. And I thought in my head, you know, I can't leave this guy here again. I felt it was kind of a test, you know, are you going to give up? And so I said, sir, do you want my help? And I yelled it, and he goes, yes. And that's all I needed, and I helped him to his feet, and we started walking, and he totally slipped and fell. And I caught him, and then I I just said, forget it. You know, and that's why I put him on my shoulders. He was covered in urine. He was wet from the snow. It stunk. Didn't even matter. The Holy Spirit was beating in my chest so hard. It was like, this is exactly what you're supposed to do. This is what you're supposed to do. And I carried him down the hill and to those doors. And there was a lot of people there. It's wintertime. Everybody's in there, and everybody held the doors open. Everybody knew he was there. And so that's when I realized there's a gap between even well-meaning Christians and the hurting and the homeless and the needy.
Give me your eyes for just 1 second. Give me your eyes so I can see everything that I keep missing. Give me your love for humanity. Give me your arms for the broken-hearted, the ones that are far beyond my reach. Give me your heart for the ones forgotten. Give me your eyes so I can see.
And we need to step out in faith and put ourselves outside of the comfort zone. And when we do, the Holy Spirit will confirm it. That's what you're supposed to do. I felt so much love for that guy I didn't know. I was crying just carrying him across the street here.
Lord, give me your eyes so I can see. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Sometimes just doing what the Lord wants you to do is the most amazing thing you're ever going to do.
Yeah.